The cold air burned his skin as the ambient light barely illuminated the room. Basement. Julia had never been high before, but somehow she immediately realized where she was. The wall, scuffed and covered with dark mold, pressed down on her, closing in on the space. The air was heavy, and it smelled musty, rotten, and metallic. How did I end up here? The thought struck her like a lightning bolt. She was driving home late at night. The driver was saying something. His voice was steady, almost lulling. She closed her eyes, and then that was it. Julia glanced at the clues. The jacket was in place, jeans and a t-shirt too, but they was nobod. She tried to move her arms but felt terrible pain in her wrists behind her back. His hands were tied. She tried to get to her feet, sliding on the damp floor. Looking around, Julia noticed a metal door on the other side of the room. It was the only way out. "Hey!" Her voice sounded too loud, echoing off the walls. She ran for the door, but before she had taken 2 steps, she stumbled and fell to her knees, hitting her shoulder on the rough concrete. Pain shot through her body, and she slowly got up again, cursing. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, pushing away the panic that had come over her. "Think, Julia, think." She rushed to the door and pushed it with her shoulder. Nonsense. No, no. She slammed her shoulder into the metal sheet again, then kicked and almost fell. "Let me out." "Hey!" The girl beat on the door over and over again until her shoulders began to ache. "Let me out, please!" Her voice broke and turned into a sob, but there was no response. In the opposite corners, the light bulb illuminated only a part of the space beyond which the dense darkness stretched. There were old boxes somewhere. Their outlines were lost in the semi-darkness. A broken chair lay against the wall. It all looked like the scenery for a scene from a horror movie. Julia felt tears welling up in her eyes. She took a step toward the drawers, trying to find something with which to free her hands from their bonds. I opened one of them with my knee. There were old women's clothes inside, covered with a thick layer of dust. Jeans, blouses, and a dress. She muttered so calmly to herself. She went back to the door and examined it. The door handle, rust stains, and nothing else. Every attempt to find something necessary for salvation brought down a new round of despair on her. There seemed to be no way out. "Hey, what do you want from me?" "Stop it!" she screamed, throwing the chain to the floor. The girl fell to her knees, breathing heavily. My head was full of questions about who had brought her here, why, and what they were going to do with her. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. Julia strained her arms with all her might, feeling the room pressing down on her. The walls seemed to be getting closer. It seemed to her that the air was thickening, filling her lungs with something sticky and heavy. She tried to pull herself together, to stifle her sobs. There must be a way out. There must be. The light bulb went out so suddenly that Julia shuddered and fell to her knees, clutching her fingers to the cold floor. Absolute darkness enveloped her, swallowing up the remnants of her sense of space. Even the faint glow of the light bulb was gone now, and my vision was pitch black. The girl screamed, feeling fear constrict every cell of her body. "No, no, help me." Her voice echoed through the room, but she didn't hear anything in response. Only his own breathing, ragged and ragged, seemed to fill the entire space. A chill gripped Julia. She found the wall with her back, bracing herself against it as if it were the only point of support. She couldn't see, but the skin of her palms behind her back felt slimy patches on the concrete surface. My head was spinning, My thoughts were confused. I'm here forever. I'll never get out of here. Flashed through my head. Panic rolled in waves. She felt the scream turn into a hysterical sob. Julia slid down powerlessly, unable to drown out the echo of her screeching, which she could now hear from everywhere. She huddled in the corner of the room. "No, no, no," she muttered through her tears, rocking back and forth. She wasn't screaming anymore, but she was sobbing so hard that her body was shaking. She didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours. Every moment seemed like an eternity. At some point, Julia felt her strength leaving her. She could no longer sit up. Her muscles were numb, and fear seemed to have drained all the warmth and energy out of her. She weakened, her head falling powerlessly to her knees. "This is the end," she thought. His eyes were slowly closing. The darkness outside merged with the darkness inside. The girl fell asleep. Everything was different in the dream. Julia stood surrounded by a gray fog. The air was humid. It smelled of rot and dampness. And through the thick fog, figures slowly loomed in front of her. 3 girls. Their skin was pale, but there were black patches of scabs in places. Chunks of flesh hung from their bodies, exposing bones and muscles. 2 of them had their eyes closed, but the third was staring at her with its empty sockets. Julia wanted to step back, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. The first girl took a step forward. Her whisper was low, but it penetrated my head like poison. "You will stay with us," she said, and there was an ominous confidence in her voice. Julia screamed, but her voice sounded weaker than she wanted it to. The second girl raised her head. Her decomposed lips barely moved, but the words sounded clear. "No, you can leave, but you have to fight. Don't give up, otherwise you'll become just like us." Julia wanted to ask what she meant, but it was as if an icy wave had washed over her body. The third girl's eye sockets were empty and inky black, as if they were sucking the life out of her. The girl didn't say a word, but there was a horror radiating from her that held her mind in check. Julia realized that her only chance was to escape from the dream, but something kept her there. 3 figures, their pale hands reaching for her as the fog grew thicker. The third girl stood motionless, her silence worse than any scream. The empty eye sockets stared straight into Julia's soul, filling her with a horror that could not be expressed in words. She stretched her arms out, and her fingers, like sharp bone claws, eagerly reached for Julia. "Don't resist him. If you obey, he will be kind." Julia tried to scream, but her throat felt like it was being squeezed by invisible hands. Her feet were rooted to the ground. She couldn't step back and couldn't even move. The first girl behind her whispered again, "You will stay with us. There's nowhere to run." The second one was almost there, shouting, "No, go away. Hit while you can. Try to get out. When he tied you up, he was drunk. Pull, twist, strain your arms. Don't feel sorry for yourself." The words got mixed up in Julia's head. She felt the cold emanating from the rotten bodies, and the sticky smell of decomposition covered her, making her wheeze in a strangled manner. Suddenly, sharp sounds of grinding and clanking began to be heard around her, as if the walls of this nightmare were collapsing. A light bulb that was not in this dream flashed somewhere above with a dim, blinding light, as if someone had turned it on purpose. And then, a sharp flash tore through the fog, driving away the sinister figures. Julia inhaled sharply, her body jerked forward. She opened her eyes and found herself in the same basement. His arms were very tense, and the ropes cut into his wrists. The light bulb on the ceiling was on again, but its light now seemed too bright, like a spotlight hurting the eyes. Julia looked at her feet in horror. It seemed to her that the black mist was still spreading across the floor. Nevertheless, she could smell the decay, as if it had stayed with her from a dream. Was it a vision or not? The girl muttered, feeling cold beads of sweat trickle down her temples. The light flashed again. Julia trembled all over, feeling that the worst was just beginning. Her chest was heaving convulsively, and her hands were shaking. She was trying to stretch the bottles, twisting her wrists, and the rope seemed to be starting to let go. Julia sat on the cold floor, feeling like her mind was still torn between reality and a nightmare. But she didn't stop stretching the rope for a second. It was painful, unbearable, but she still endured. Suddenly, there was a screeching sound in the room. The massive metal door began to slowly open, as if it was being pushed from the other side. The sound of rusty hinges cut through the ear, filling the room with an ominous echo. Julia froze. Her heart seemed to stop. She rose abruptly to her feet, her gaze fixed on the door. "My God," she whispered. Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. A figure appeared in the gap. A man, short, stooped, with an uneven gait. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but there was enough light to see the gleam in his small, prickly eyes. In one hand he held an old stained knife, the blade of which gleamed dully in the light of the light bulb. Julia took a step back, feeling panic take over her mind. Who are you?" she gasped, but her voice was lost in the silence. The man crossed the threshold, slowly, with chilling confidence. His gaze slowly swept over her figure, assessing her like a predator that has already caught its prey. "You, mine, now," he said. His voice sounded low and husky, as if he was deliberately savoring every word. Julia pressed herself against the wall, her gaze darting from the door to the knife in his hand. "What? What do you want?" Her voice was shaking. She couldn't believe that all this was happening in reality. But all this time, with superhuman strength, she was tearing the rope behind her back. The man grinned, baring his teeth. His smile was unpleasant, almost bestial. "You're my toy," he said, coming closer. "And all that's required of you is submission." His words were calm, but there was a threat in them that penetrated to the very heart. "No, please, let me go, let me go," whispered Julia. Her body was shaking with terror. The man slowly raised the knife, displaying it as if he were displaying a valuable relic. The blade was old, covered with small scratches, and there were dark spots on its surface that resembled blood. "If you're a good girl, maybe I'll let you go when I've had enough of playing." And he tilted his head to the side, studying her reaction. Julia felt her legs weaken, and she slid to the floor, pressing herself against the wall. Her mind could not accept what was happening. It was a nightmare, another vision. She closed her eyes, hoping that everything would disappear. But when she opened them again, the man was also standing in front of her. His knife was so close that she could see every notch on its blade. "Please, please, let me go," Julia squeezed out through tears. Her voice broke into a sob. The man bent down, almost touching her face with his. His breathing was heavy, with an unpleasant smell of rot and tobacco. "You don't understand. There's no way out. It's just me and you belong to me." The man bent closer, his hands reaching for Julia's t-shirt. His fingers were bony, dirty, with broken nails that resembled claws, and his gaze, filled with madness, seemed to pierce right through her. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. His voice was breaking, turning into a nervous mumble. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You're mine now." Her back bit into the cold wall, but there was nowhere to retreat to. She saw his hands coming closer, and she felt more trapped by the second. "No!" she screamed, jerking her arms behind her back with all her might. The man leaned into her ear, his breath burning her skin. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid," he kept repeating, and these words now sounded like a maniacal mantra. And suddenly, "Fight!" came a soft whisper next to his ear. "Don't give up. The rope is almost untied." Julia froze. The voice was barely audible, but so clear that, for a moment, she thought she was dreaming again. Her body acted faster than her mind. She jerked her arms one last time and felt free. With a wild cry, like a wounded animal, she rushed forward and grabbed the man's face. Her fingers found his eyes, and she pressed down with all her might. The man howled, his scream echoing through the basement. "You bitch!" he yelled, grabbing her by the arms and trying to push her away. But Julia wouldn't let go. She could feel her nails tearing at his skin, and he was waving the knife in a rage, trying to hit her. To sharply knee in the groin. He doubled over, and his howl became even louder. "You bastard, I hate you," he growled, but he didn't have time to finish. The knife finally found her, sliding across her cheek. Julia felt a sharp pain. Hot blood flowed down her face, but she did not stop. "No!" she screamed and ran for the door. The man tried to grab her leg, but she dodged and, without looking back, jumped out the door. And then, clutching the door with her hands, she slammed it with all her might. Julia stood in the hallway, breathing heavily and holding the door closed. An inhuman squeak came from inside. "No! No! Don't! I didn't mean to! I'm sorry!" the man howled. His voice was breaking and turning into something unreal. And then, through his screams, a woman's laughter rang out. Julia froze. The laughter was cold, piercing, filling the narrow corridor with horror. She could feel the sound penetrating right into her consciousness, making the hairs on her skin stand on end. A real cacophony began outside the door. The man's whiskers, the sounds of blows, and that unbearable laughter. Julia retreated in horror, looking at the door as if it could open at any second. "I didn't mean to. Don't. I'm sorry. I just wanted to play," the man shouted one last time, and then everything suddenly went quiet. Julia was sitting on a hard chair at the police station. Her hands were clutching a mug of cold tea. She was still shaking, trying to catch her breath after the endless interrogations. The police did not hide their skepticism, listening to her confused story. The basement, the maniac with the knife, his insane screams and someone's female laughter. But everything changed when the investigation team arrived at the scene. The basement turned out to be a real trap. A massive door, thick walls, heavy air saturated with dampness. There was chaos inside. Overturned boxes and broken furniture, bloodstains on the floor and walls, and in the center of the room, experts found what was left of the man himself. His body was literally torn to pieces, blood splattered all around, but this did not shock the police. The man's face had been stripped clean off. "Damn, I've never seen anything like this," said one of the experts, examining the crime scene. It was as if an animal had attacked him. Later, one of the experts, examining the stains on the floor, noticed strange irregularities in the concrete. It seemed to him that there might be walled-up cavities. The group Komenda decided to check the guess. There was a crash, and the jackhammer easily penetrated the concrete layer. And soon, right under the floor, the team discovered something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Bodies. There were 3 of them, or what was left of them. The remains of 3 young girls whose skulls and traces of torture, miraculously preserved in the concrete skin, indicated that these unfortunate girls had experienced real hell before their deaths. "Holy shit," one of the policemen whispered, kneeling down next to the pit. "We found them." After the examination, it was established that the bodies belonged to the girls who had gone missing several years ago. All these years they had been here, hidden by cancer and their half-decomposed bodies, and the whisper that had saved her life. The police closed the case. The maniac, who was never given a name, was dead, and the souls of the 3 girls finally found peace. It took Julia a long time to recover from the horror she had to go through. But sitting at home, she felt strangely relieved. And sometimes it seemed to her that on quiet nights, she hears whispers. But now he was calm, almost grateful.